All right. Well, welcome everyone to High Tech Live. Bienvenidos. If you're new to High Tech, welcome. I'm Viviana Costa. I'm the Executive Director of High Tech, and we are always so excited to bring this community together. If this is your first High Tech Live, this is a bi-monthly series where we bring together the Hispanic technology community together to connect, share, and learn something new. Our sessions are informal conversations where we really get to hear from you guys, our partners and our community members, on topics that touch on tech, leadership, D&I, and everything in between. As always, we always do a little bit of networking at the end. So if you can, please stick around. Before I introduce our session, a couple housekeeping points. Please mute yourself for now until the end. We will have time at the end where you can share your comments and questions. So please keep them in mind, and we'll have a little Q&A session at the end. So let's get to it. Today, we are going to get perspective from our partners at Thoughtworks on the evolving tech talent landscape. So with us today is Chief Talent Officer Joanna Parke and People Support Generalist and Latin ERG Lead of Unidos, Crystal Perez. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and provide their background, but what I will share is that Joanna is going to share with us her personal journey, her perspective on the current tech landscape, and her thoughts on the ongoing tension between the supply and demand of talent in this digital age. So Joanna, Crystal, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights with our High Tech familia. So with that, Crystal, please take the virtual stage. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Viv. Very excited. Hola a todos. Happy Friday to be here today with Joanna. I want to start off. I am the People Support Generalist at Thoughtworks and the co-lead for Unidos, which is our Latinx ERG. I've been with Thoughtworks for about 4 years now. I'm based out of Chicago, and with the Unidos and relaunching and all of that for about 2 years now. Very excited because high tech is something that we're always plugging within the group. So it's exciting to be on the other side of it and to have Joanna with us. So I'll turn it over to Joanna for your intro.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joanna Parke. I'm also very excited to be here with you today. I am currently the Chief Talent Officer at Thoughtworks. I'm based in Chicago, like Crystal, and I've been with Thoughtworks almost 20 years. My anniversary is coming up in a couple of weeks. So
that's exciting.
Yeah.
Actually, this is a great start to my first question because I had it that, or I had written down that you started with us in 2003, and you weren't actually in the talent space. You were on the other side of professional services. So if you could just talk to us a little bit about.
I'm so sorry.
I'll give you a second. It happens. So just talk to us a little bit, Joanna, about your journey that, pivoted you from one to the other and what that path looked like.
Yeah, that's absolutely happy to start there. So I'll go back maybe even before I joined Thoughtworks. So I always knew I wanted to be an engineer growing up. My father was an engineer, and I was encouraged to pursue math and science as a young girl, which was, sort of unusual for women my age at the time. So I feel very fortunate to have had that start in life. I did go to school to study engineering, so attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign to study electrical engineering. And I was really going down that path of electrical engineering. And but at the time, it was 1999 as I was getting ready to kind of wrap up college. And we know from our history lessons that was really around the time of the dot-com boom. And so I was kind of observing what was happening and seeing what was happening in the world, in the industry, and thinking like that internet thing seems pretty exciting. And so I switched a little bit from electrical engineering into computer science and added that as a minor and studied that towards the end of my college career. So I did go into programming. I had a couple of jobs out right out of college, was laid off a few times in the dot-com bust. So what went up came down very quickly. But by then I had really fallen in love with coding and software development. And I found Thoughtworks through Martin Fowler. So Martin Fowler is an author. He's written many books about different technology topics, but the one that really got me was a book called Refactoring. And I read it as a young software developer, and it really just completely changed the way that I thought about software and how it could be kind of a living, evolving thing. So I followed Martin to Thoughtworks, and at the time, Thoughtworks was just 300 people in the entire company. Marilyn, who's on the call today, was there before me in those very early days. And it was just a very exciting place to be. The company, even at that size of 300 people, had a very ambitious agenda, a very ambitious mission. At the time, it was all about revolutionizing the IT industry. And I just thought, wow, that is so, it was so exciting and impressive for such a small company to make those kinds of bold claims and statements. So I wanted to be a part of it very much. And I did join as a developer. I worked as a developer for the first few years at Thoughtworks, and eventually went into project management. And then in 2010, Thoughtworks as a global company started to get a lot more serious actually about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our CEO at the time had set some goals around shifting the makeup of our population. And so I was really fortunate to be given an opportunity to help start a graduate program in North America with a focus on diversity. So I left the consulting side of the business and moved over to the operations side. And was part of that kind of transformation of our business, working across our people teams, our staffing teams, and our client services teams. In 2013, I became managing director for our North America business, which is the Thoughtworks' largest business unit. So really a kind of true general management role across the business. And then fast forward to today, I've been in the Chief Talent Officer role for about 4 years, and I work globally with all of our regional business units and thinking about talent and how Thoughtworks continues to attract and develop what we believe to be the best technical talent in the industry. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And, as you're thinking through how are we attracting that new talent, what does the actual day-to-day look like as you're thinking about making, accomplishing those goals?
Yeah, my day-to-day is all over the place. No day is the same. I think one day I might be working with one of our regional teams that's thinking about, how do we bring our brand to a community of people that maybe we've never focused on before. Maybe we're trying to develop a new capability and we're not as well known in that space. I work closely with our DEI groups in terms of how we're bringing equity and inclusion into our talent practices on a day-to-day basis. I work with our L&D and capabilities teams to think about how we're deploying programs to grow and develop leaders or other capabilities that we might need in the business. So is really broad in scope and never a dull moment. There's always exciting things happening in Thoughtworks, especially when you look across the globe. So we currently operate in 17 countries. And are more than 10,000 people. So it's just been kind of an exciting last 4 years as we've thought about how to grow and scale across that footprint.
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting because your pivot into the talent space started in 2010. The New York Times recently published an article titled "The Tech Bubble That Never Burst," and it actually has a timeline that starts in 2010, has all the experts saying it's going to burst up until today. So can you talk a little bit about, as the industry continues to grow and consumer demand evolves, the bubble has not burst as it's been predicting. What does that mean for the tech talent landscape and the evolution of it?
Yeah, I think thinking of technology as kind of this separate thing is, if we think about that now as compared to 10 years ago, it feels like almost a foreign idea, right? In that technology is powering and driving every business on the planet. And I think the pandemic clearly accelerated digital transformation. So if we think about the pandemic and how it impacted the world and how it changed consumer behavior, every company is ramping up and thinking about how to accelerate the transformation of their business and the way that they interact with their clients. If we think about the number of people who, now order groceries online or now do their banking online that weren't doing that 2-3 years ago, there's just been this huge shift. And so we believe that, we're just at the early stages of that transformation. There's still so much more that businesses can do with technology and data. And so from a talent perspective, that demand is increasing at a rate that is faster than the supply is increasing. So we are seeing definitely a shortage of technical talent, digital skills, and that's something that I think every business is wrestling with and is definitely having a very real impact. Korn Ferry did a study a couple of years ago, and they tried to quantify the talent shortage. And I think the number, it was a mind-blowing number, something like, in 10 years that $1 trillion of lost productivity will happen because, there's just not enough people with the right skills that's needed for what businesses are demanding.
And you touched on how we're pivoting from the pandemic. How has the actual role of the technologist changed through the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is a topic I'm super passionate about. I have talked in the past about the role of the technologist, and the way we think about it at Thoughtworks is really with 3 kinds of types of stakeholders, if you will. So we talk about the impact that technologists have on the technology industry. And so the responsibility to kind of keep evolving the state of the art, the state of the practice, how technology adds value, right? So there's the kind of discipline or the practice side of things. Then there's the business side. So I think today more than ever, right, technology is the deciding factor in the outcomes of the business, right? How well do you connect with customers? How well do you service those customers? Like how you can retain customers is all driven by technology. And so as technologists, thinking about the business value, the customer value that our technology is creating, I think is an important responsibility. And then last but certainly not least, the technologist has a responsibility to society. And we have seen, extreme examples where technology can provide a lot of value for society. It can be a very positive thing, and then it can be a very damaging and negative thing, often, due to unintended consequences. So Thoughtworks has done some really great work in terms of thinking about responsible technology and how can technologists work with business stakeholders to try to foresee some of those unintended consequences and put mitigations into place. So I still believe that the technology, the role of the technologist is to think about and have an impact in all 3 of those spaces. And I would just say that as a result of the pandemic, it's probably just amplified, right? If we think about going back to the digital transformation way and businesses being driven more and more by technology, those impacts are just greater.
Yeah. Can you dig a little bit deeper into the responsibilities and, some things that people should be keeping top of mind as, things are still shifting?
Yeah, I think the business outcomes is a really important one. I think one of the things that has been challenging that we've seen is as the technology landscape expands, it requires more and more people actually to get things done. So if you think about, 10, 20 years ago, the technology landscape or the technology stack that say I as a developer would have used 20 years ago is just infinitely more simple than what we have today, right? Today, you need data experts, you need infrastructure experts, you need, developers who write code, you need UI, you need mobile, you need all of these skills really to do any sort of impactful business initiative. And so the need for all of those skills to come together and collaborate in a way that still leads to good business outcomes is something that I think, requires more from a social skills, a collaboration, a communication skills from our technologists.
Yeah, thank you. So talking about the talent landscape and candidates, what has the organizational experience been like to be able to shift? And how has that impacted the candidate experience?
That's a great question. So we are really fortunate, actually. We did a number of research studies that was kind of in conjunction with some work that we were doing on our employer brand. So we actually went out and asked candidates what was important to them, in our target demographic. So we went out and kind of talked to senior technologists, and we did that a few years ago, pre-pandemic, and then we did it last year during the pandemic. So it was fascinating to see how the answers changed. There were some things which were common, of course, career progression, compensation, right? These are things that are consistent and consistently important to people when they think about their next job opportunity. But some of the things that shifted, I think pre-pandemic, we saw a strong desire for senior technologists to have a high level of influence. They wanted to have a voice within their business. They wanted to kind of directly impact business strategy and business outcomes. So that was something that came out very clear at the top of the list, kind of pre-pandemic. Last year, kind of in the midst of the pandemic, we saw a lot more about job security because there was a huge economic impact at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we saw this kind of split where some companies actually accelerated, grew, and did financially better than ever. And some were the opposite, right? And we did see a number of layoffs across the industry. And so job security was something people were more focused on than they were before pandemic. But the one that's really fascinating for me, and I think the one that has worked to the benefit of Thoughtworks, because it's something we've historically been strong at, is this concept of psychological safety. So candidates talked a lot about, I want to work in a place where I feel respected. I feel taken care of, like the company cares about me. I feel like I'm heard, like I have a voice, like it's okay to speak my mind. It's more than okay, it's accepted, right? So that whole concept of psychological safety became much more important to people, I think, as the pandemic sort of forced everyone to rethink everything about their lives. I think a lot of people kind of realized that maybe they were working in an environment where they were not able to kind of contribute their best because that wasn't the culture that they had. I mentioned this is something that we care a lot about at Thoughtworks, and I think there's a few reasons why it's a part of our culture. At least we aspire for it to be part of our culture. One goes back to the founder of Thoughtworks. So a guy called Roy Singham had very kind of forward-looking views on people and culture and companies and management. He was a follower of Dee Hock, who is a founder of Visa, who wrote a lot about people management and culture. And at the time of founding Thoughtworks almost 30 years ago, Roy was thinking a lot about knowledge workers. So if you think about Thoughtworks, the name comes from the concept of knowledge workers. And he was thinking a lot about how that would be different, and things like the traditional management structure from the industrial age, right? A very top-down, hierarchical, managers tell you what to do, you do it how they tell you to do it. I think he was very early in foreseeing that way of working was not what was going to be effective in a knowledge worker environment. That was not going to be the way that you got the best out of people in a creative, intellectual knowledge worker environment. And so there were a lot of things that he set up from the culture of Thoughtworks about, flat hierarchies, about open and transparent communication, about it being okay to, speak your mind, to ask challenging questions of leaders, and these sorts of things. So that was part of our culture from the beginning. And then I think the other thing that has had a huge influence on us is the Agile software movement. So Thoughtworks has been a kind of strong and early adopter and proponent of the Agile software movement. A number of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto are current or former Thoughtworkers. And so it really became embedded in the company and how we did things. And there's a lot about Agile practices that lend itself to this concept of psychological safety, right? The focus on the team, the ceremonies that we follow, something as simple as a retrospective. So a retrospective, where you sit down as a team and you collectively reflect on what has happened, what we could do differently, what could be better in the future. And that simple ceremony really sets a tone that everyone on the team has ideas to contribute, right? That everyone on the team is expected to think about and contribute to that continuous improvement mindset. So just a couple of sort of things that I think have allowed us to have that kind of culture.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had new folks joining our team and letting them know, like, day one, you're contributing, you're into this retro and you have ideas that we want to hear. So definitely something that we've been able to capture, I think, not just in the professional services space, but incorporate it into operations as well. I wanted to take a step back because I know you had said that the psychological safety is something that had already worked in our advantage, but what are some of the things that came out of that feedback that actually ended up pivoting our strategy versus things that we already had working, for us?
Out of the candidate feedback? Yeah, I think back to the career progression, one of the things that we've been working on as a company for the last few years is, I think if you think back to what I said about Roy and his concept about knowledge workers and giving them a lot of kind of freedom and space to grow and move, Thoughtworks' approach to career progression was very open. Like, we want you to grow, we want you to learn, we want you to do new things, we want you to be poly-skilled. But we didn't have a really traditional structured, career progression mechanism. Some people would joke that it was the choose your own adventure at Thoughtworks, right? And I do think, there was a lot of benefits to that, and that it's not constraining. And for some people, it's very freeing, right? That they can kind of create the version of themselves that is most exciting to them and that fits into their team and is most impactful. But for other people, it can feel quite overwhelming and quite hard to navigate. So over the last few years, we've been trying to strike the right balance and not losing that, driving your own career, having the flexibility to, make lateral moves or diagonal moves or whatever that looks like for you, but also trying to put a little bit of structure into place so that people can have something to grab onto and understand, what that looks like at Thoughtworks.
Awesome. Thank you. Any advice for organizations that are making that shift or pivot for their talent pools in order to be able to respond to the pandemic and the growth?
Yeah, I think when I talk to executives from other companies, clients, one of the things that is very much top of mind is culture. I think a lot of companies are thinking about the culture that they have and trying to evolve it, from a very traditional kind of hierarchical culture into one that's more egalitarian and more inclusive of different voices. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? Some of it is kind of DEI driven, and some of it is just understanding that skilled knowledge workers, work better in that environment. So that's definitely something that I think is a great thing for companies to focus on. Somewhat related to that, the whole concept of employee experience, developer experience has become a very big trend. And a lot of that, especially the developer experience, is about understanding what in your organization is standing in people's way of doing their best work. Like, what are those friction points that are causing people to have to expend energy on things that are not maybe the best use of their time. So I think that's a valuable pursuit for companies as they think about how to attract and retain talent. And then the last thing I would say is because of the talent shortage, I think companies are sort of waking up to the fact that there just is a shortage. They're never going to be able to compete on hiring alone. They're no longer can rely on kind of educational institutions to create the talent that they need. And so there's definitely a rise of investment in creating and developing talent. The more that companies can get good at upskilling, reskilling their talent to kind of keep up with the latest and greatest skills that they need, it is just a better strategy than trying to go out and compete for those very scarce, talent pools.
Thank you. So adding another layer on top of that, the gender and diversity metrics that we have around talent pools, you shared that it was something that you were focusing on 10 plus years ago, and very recently Thoughtworks actually published our metrics. And so can you talk a little bit about how that has benefited us and worked in our advantage to be able to ride the wave of the impact of the pandemic?
Yes, definitely. So our journey towards DEI, I think it really did start about 12 years ago, and it did start with gender. And when we published our goals on the website, they are goals just because gender is a universal thing. If we get into things like race and ethnicity, obviously that's different in the US as it is in China. So as a global company, that's the one thing that we do publish externally, but each country, each region has additional, elements that they focus on relevant to the communities in their country. So we did start with gender about 12 years ago, and it started with a story that our CTO loves to tell, Rebecca Parsons. I believe she's met with this group in the past, but how you have that management team meeting like once a month, and there's, like the business report that you go through, and there's like a standard set of slides, right? And she told the story that, there was a slide in the deck that was like our gender diversity globally. And every month it was like the same thing, like no progress, no progress, no progress. And she just kind of lost it one day. And she said, let's either do something about this or take out the slide, because I'm just tired of seeing the lack of progress. Like, why are we even talking about it? So it was one of those kind of legendary moments in the company history. And, following that, our CEO at the time set kind of a mandate that Thoughtworks University, which is our entry-level graduate program, would be, 50-50 gender equal going forward. And at the time, that was like a big deal. We were nowhere near that. And so everyone had to kind of go back and think differently about how we were going to achieve that. And so we kind of broke all the rules and all of the constraints and the sacred cows. And we changed where we looked for talent. We changed, the educational background of who we were hiring. We changed how we, brought people in and supported them through training, mentoring, shadowing, et cetera. And that was really the beginning of the journey. And then since then, it's just kind of expanded and thinking about more communities, intersectionality, and bringing in more of the pieces of equity and inclusion.
Thank you for sharing that story, because I didn't know that. And I love those little aha moments that kind of add more context to the path, Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So I know that after this, we were going to turn it over for Q&A. Any final thoughts, Joanna, before we switch, how we're styling the Zoom call?
No, I think we covered a good part of it, everything from digital transformation to psychological safety to DEI. So I would welcome questions and love to dive deeper in any of the areas we talk about, or if people have, completely different directions they want to go, that's fine too.
Questions, guys.
Sorry, I was looking for Viv on the screen.
I'm here.
I see you.
All right, we got a question in the chat. How do we best reskill our Latinx community? Oops, the chat moved on me. The Latinx community to be the right people with the right skills.
Great question. So I can just kind of maybe start with the skills that I see in in the most demand, and what I think will probably continue to be in the most demand in the future. Certainly from a technology perspective, any skills having to do with data, artificial intelligence, cloud, those skills continue to be extremely hot, extremely in short supply and demand. It's not just the people with the kind of very deep, data scientists, data engineers, but we're also seeing across the board that all roles need to kind of up their game in terms of data acumen. So business analysts, project managers, business people, everyone needs to kind of learn that data awareness, data acumen. So that is definitely, it's what I call a no regret thing, data skills. And then the other thing I would say is something I kind of touched on, which is the technical skills are obviously super critical, but those collaboration and communication skills, that's what really sets apart, good people from great people. And I think then when you add on remote working, like the ability to kind of collaborate, communicate, resolve conflict, influence people, take them on a journey. Those are timeless skills, I think, but they're even more in demand today. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Other questions?
Martha, what is left to know?
I'll ask a question. Joanna, what's Thoughtworks' view on work from home versus back to the office, especially since you have such a global firm? In fact, the majority of your people aren't even in the US.
That is true. Yeah. It definitely varies by country. So we leave that decision up to our countries because there's so much varying context, but just in case people are curious, I'll give you a little tour around the world. So China actually, which we know was hit with COVID first. China went back to pre-COVID working models like as quickly as possible. People are traveling again. We have, a lot of our people are in the office together. They spend maybe a little less time in the client environment and a little more time in our offices, but they kind of went back to pre-pandemic working ways right away. If I contrast that, let's say with India or Brazil, India and Brazil both had, as we saw in many places, right? They tend to be countries where people migrate from the countryside, the smaller towns, into the big cities for jobs. So when the pandemic hit, they went back home, many of them. And so the team was showing me a map the other day where we're, tracking where people are physically located. So pre-pandemic in India, we had 6 offices. Today, Thoughtworkers in India are located in more than 600 towns and cities. It's really amazing when you see it, and Brazil's pretty similar. So they have both adopted they've just embraced remote working. And so what we're trying to do in those countries is, again, understand where people went and where we have communities of people. So we can say, hey, did you know there's 10 other Thoughtworkers in your town? Like, and we'll encourage them to get together. In our countries where we tended to have more on-site client presence, I think it's still early days. We're not seeing a strong demand from our clients to get back into the office. I think, we just had an Omicron wave, and I think people are still a little nervous about that. So the new normal is yet to be seen, but I will say, I don't think anyone thinks we're going back to the way things were before. So if anything, where we would have been together 5 days a week and, in the office, it's going to look much different. But we're trying to take a very kind of flexible, let the team decide what's right for them approach. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question I want to throw out there.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Joanna, to that legendary moment that you talked about, right?
Yeah.
And how it was at that moment that you guys kind of changed and pivoted.
Yeah.
How did you know what direction or what changes you need to make in your processes and things that you were doing to foster that elevated inclusivity?
Yeah. Great question. I think to be honest, it was a lot of trial and error. So
enough.
I think the formula that worked was like set a big audacious goal and then unleash people to kind of figure it out, I think one of the things that we figured out through really it was a trial and error thing was, a lot of companies say like, oh, we want to hire, more women or more African Americans or more Latinx. And then they'll say, but there's none of them in the computer science degree, right? In the computer science department. And we kind of figured out by finding a couple great people that you didn't need a computer science degree to be a good developer. We found people who had other STEM degrees. We even found people who were like music majors, but they built themselves a website and they fell in love with coding. And like, that was enough for us to be able to latch onto. So, and then it kind of snowballed from there, right? You find a couple people and then there's this, previously held rule or constraint that you had that a computer science degree was required. And then you figure out it's not. So I do think there's a lot of trial and error and figuring out where that boundary is. So we did kind of experiment a lot with like, exactly how much coding experience do you need? Like, how far can we push that, right? And then we figure out like, oh, you need this kind of level of understanding, before you can really kind of jump into our programs and things like that. So
That's awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm going to piggyback that question with one more because we have a lot of folks that mentor in our community, and I'm sure folks on this call mentor young folks that are kind of looking to get into this space. And this is as I mentor folks, and especially at the high school level, I always like ask myself, am I like putting them in the right direction, right? And so my question is, what is some like advice that we can provide to those that we're mentoring on like, this is how you can put yourself on a successful path into a tech career? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as a starting point, I believe that tech is such a great career. And so if we think about motivating or inspiring people to go into that, there's a couple of things that I talk about when I talk to young people. I think one, and this is again important to people, like it is a very financially secure career path, right? The skills are in very high demand. You can, have a successful career, be able to provide for your family and be successful in this career path. That's one thing, right? Number two, you have the ability to have a huge influence and impact. So when I talked about like the role of the technologist, going into tech it's a driving force behind business. It is the thing that is, changing society. And so to be a part of that, I think is really inspiring. And then for people from, marginalized communities, you have an even bigger role to play in that you can be that role model, right? You can, you were telling me about your push-up, push-up, pull-up. And I love that. I think that's, to be that role model and to be able to help the next generation coming behind you. So I think those motivators that really help people think, about why they're doing it. And I always feel like having that, Thoughtworks, we call it your why, right? Your purpose, like those help you through the tough times. So when you're going through a difficult time or you're doubting yourself or you're not sure that, you could do this, those are the things that kind of keep you going. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Appreciate that insight.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
I'll keep going just to make sure it's not quiet.
Go
Joanna, so, since this is a Hispanic community, and let me kind of focus on that a little bit.
Yeah.
So Hispanics is one of the fastest growing minorities. It has one of the largest young people percentages of the overall population,
Yeah.
and is typically recognized for being very tech savvy.
Mm.
However, they're not very well represented in technology compared to their population. I'm talking about the U.S., of course.
Yes. Yeah.
Compared to their population, right? Representation in tech firms like yourselves.
Yeah.
Is very small, and especially even more so, right, at the senior levels, at the management tiers.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts around what can we do differently, right, to help encourage young Hispanics to get more interested in technology careers?
Yeah. So I think some of it is the inspiration, the reasons that they would want to do it, right? But the opportunity needs to be created, right? The path needs to be cleared. And I think what we've seen that we can learn perhaps from other communities that have kind of gone before is that it's a very slow burn to start, and then there's a snowball effect. So if I just take our experience with women, mostly because we've been at it the longest, right? So we have the most history to learn from. It was not easy in the early days, right? Like you're especially, let's take, women who, let's say, were not in computer science degree, and you're trying to convince them to drop whatever they've been going to school for, come join us and be a developer, right? You've got this kind of stereotypical view about the culture in tech, and there's some, you read the news, there's some very real, terrible stories that come out of big tech companies about how historically discriminated against groups are treated in these companies, right? So I feel like that the cracking it open is the hardest part. And the only thing that I know that's made that successful is one, those role models, and two, finding those people that are kind of brave enough and bold enough to want to be some of the first. And so that is the hardest part, because once you get kind of critical mass, then, your push up, pull up, it starts to grow exponentially, right? And people go to interviews and they start to see people that look like them in the interview panel, and they come to the company and they're on teams with, people that they, represent. So then it just kind of, it snowballs and it expands. And so I do think, back to your question, like what can be done? I think that intentional focus on how do we connect and engage with these communities? And this is from a company perspective I'm talking about, right? That's our responsibility as a company, to connect and engage with communities and to help show them a path that is exciting to them, where they feel like they're going to be welcomed and that the company is going to invest in their growth and development. And then again, that we're trying to build that momentum so that the reality matches the words, the experience matches the intent.
Thank you. So we have a question for Crystal. Putting you on the spot here, Crystal. What is the pulse on your Hispanic ERG group across North America? What advice would you have? What advice would you give someone, who is trying to make a business case on the importance of ERGs?
Great question, because I think it kind of feeds into Benny's question, that was the population just isn't represented within, organizations as it is in the country. And so one of the things that we did with the Unidos is we kind of launched the year right before the year the pandemic hit, to try to create that community space, but realizing that there weren't a whole lot of folks. And so that first year we really focused on how do we get people connected? How do we build community? And then pivoting a little bit more, this year, as we're talking about goals, is to how do we help people grow? And so aside from just building community and with us connecting, Joanna said that there's that piece of people in other regions trying to figure out where those communities are. We've tried to do that in North America, people flagging, this is where I am across North America, so we can start creating small communities outside of just where our home offices are. It's still a struggle. I think people are fatigued with Zoom and always being on calls, and the pandemic was just mentally draining. So I think being able to let people know we're still doing something and meeting people where they are. And I say that because the ERG is something that's run with myself and a co-lead, and we have people who are involved in it, and then we have some people who are just absorbing the information that we're putting out there and the different resources that we're building out. We had feedback recently that people are interested in doing more in person. And so that's something that we're working on, is what does that look like to be in person again, to make it safe, make it accessible for people who aren't in person, or other home offices, or in cities where we don't have home offices. So there's definitely been communications about not just building the community, but then career path and supporting each other. And, you know, folks who are more senior, how do we get them to share that knowledge and those resources to folks who aren't as senior, so that we can be pulling each other up? So just some thoughts out there.
No, appreciate that. I mean, we had a panel this past spring talking about ERGs, and one of our speakers was like, you know, we need to get beyond the like, let's get together to have drinks and food, right? Like, let's get beyond, like, let's just like come together for that. Like, we really need to have these like serious conversations. And to your point, Crystal, where leadership really needs to kind of show up and be part of those conversations so that people feel like they're being invested in and taken care of, right? And so, yeah, love that.
Yeah, and I do think it's a process. I think if like we had launched Unidos and right away it said, hey, all the seniors come here, and we hadn't had a foundation of where the community was and what the community wanted. So it kind of feels a natural path of where we were a few years ago and where we're trying to shift towards.
Definitely. Does anybody else have, I guess, experiences with their own ERGs that they want to share with the group, or things that they're doing, you know, well and want to kind of share across? I'm putting everyone on the spot.
Yeah, I don't think I touched on the importance of the ERGs, but I just saw Tim's comment in the chat. And I think, you know, as we're still trying to figure out what ERGs are and how we support folks, it's still a nice point, connection point for folks. This morning, I actually had a call with someone who joined Thoughtworks, I think January, February, myself and the co-lead, and just having an introduction of what's your experience been like. She's someone who pivoted into tech. And so being able to make those one-on-one connections, we spoke to her and ended up mentioning someone who's in our New York office who also pivoted into tech. And so that's, I think, where the ERGs are important, whether it's a one-on-one point or a larger organization point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The one-on-one point is so key, especially now because, like, to your point, like with Zoom fatigue and everything else, sometimes it's hard to carve out that time to have those one-on-one sessions where you feel like you can kind of share and understand. And so, yeah, that's so equally important as the group setting versus also kind of that one-on-one connection as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Benny, agree with you on that. So I had a question on when we were talking about opportunities for folks. What came to mind, I've had a few folks come to me around, they're kind of mid-career and they're not in the tech space, but want to pivot into the tech space. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how we can provide guidance to folks that are really kind of, you know, they've been in one industry for, you know, half of their career, but now really kind of looking into technology, and they're kind of starting from square one, right? What would be a good entry point?
It's a great question. So I think there's probably two types of path into tech that I would think about. So one is the people that really want to go deep into a technology role. So they want to pivot from whatever they were doing before, and they want to go into, you know, being a software developer or some very deeply technical role. We have a lot of those people coming into Thoughtworks. So I mentioned Thoughtworks University is our entry-level program. We've seen, depending on the year, up to like 25% of the people coming into that program are not college graduates, they're career changers. And so they're people who often, there's a lot of boot camps out there. So they'll go to a boot camp to get kind of a kickstart in coding, and they'll come into a company like Thoughtworks into an entry-level program. So that is definitely one path that we see is very common. But I do think that people from other industries can find a place in technology, even aside from the deep technology path. So I mentioned the need for collaboration and for bringing together lots of different capabilities to deliver business outcomes. Like, those are skills that are useful in other industries as well. So I think, roles like project management or business analysis, there are roles that are involved in the creation of software where the skills are somewhat, transferable from other types of jobs and other types of industries. So that is something I think people could explore, as well as being perhaps more on that that side of the software development team, or even being, more on the business side, working more closely with tech, but in the business or industry that they come from is another possibility.
Awesome. Appreciate that.
Wanna
Andrea, yeah, go for it.
add to what Joanna said, and that's a great path into the industry. I in my field, I'm in consulting, and we see a lot of people who just love, setting up their own technology at home and creating their own clouds at home and doing, those small projects at home. And what we've recommended for them to kind of segue into more of the business world with those skills is, to find a nonprofit or some sort of charity, some organization where you can build a website or, help them do something. You get that real world experience, you get the credit for it, and then you're able to take that and move on into a more commercial type of role.
That's
I love
great
that.
advice. Yeah, great advice.
Yeah.
Looks like Julio has his hand raised.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen is in our industry, and in my career, we find people, it's not so much how do you migrate to technology. If you don't want to be a technologist, you got to hide from it. So it's coming for you any way you get it. So what we do is we actively look into our operations group and look for the people that have the aptitude and are already doing it within them. And, there's so many technologies that are, it's not just coding, it's supporting, I'm from the ag industry. And if you've ever seen the air conditioning unit in a cooler, it's heavy tech. There's a lot of PLCs and programming those people have learned it, and they actually migrate into the pure tech things very well, or they stay where they are and do quite well. But really, it's not, is tech migrating? How do you migrate into tech? It's people have to actively stay away from it.
Yeah, that is such a great point. I love that you mentioned PLCs. So PLCs are programmable logic controllers, and I mentioned that I was an electrical engineering major. So they're usually the things that you program to control machinery. And so that's how I got my start, actually, was programmable logic controllers. And then I was able to easily translate those skills into programming. It's all about logic and algorithms, and there's a lot of correlation. That's great. I love that. You gotta hide from it. I'm gonna steal that. I love that. That's great.
Other comments or questions? We got a few minutes left. Let's squeeze the juice.
Joanna, I'll ask another one. So one of the ways that I think many companies can improve their representation, right, of diverse communities that aren't in tech like they should be, is to be more open to remote work. Because frankly, what happens is often the headquarters location isn't where the diverse talent is. And I think many are missing an opportunity if they're not open to that angle. What's your thoughts on that?
I 100% agree. And we're seeing that become very real in many of the countries that we operate in. So there's a couple of examples. And I think, I can't remember, it was one of the big consulting firms was the first to do it, but in the pandemic announced that they were starting new programs in India to kind of target people who are living in remote environments from diverse communities. In Australia, we've actually spun up a virtual delivery center that is focused mostly on hiring Aboriginal Native Australians. And they're just, typically not living in a major city. So I absolutely agree. I think what is very exciting and promising is I have seen a shift in some of our most, what I would call historically traditional or conservative companies. So one big client, I won't name, in the US was a very headquartered based client. Like they, would never allow anyone to work outside of headquartered city. Everyone had to be there. And so was quite limiting. And a year into the pandemic, they were like, wow, they're like, okay, our thinking has just changed completely. Like we never thought that we would be able to work like this. And so they've completely shifted their talent strategy, and they now hire from across the US, to have that. So I do think mindsets are changing and shifting. I think the big unknown, and we're all living in a great big experiment, is what is this going to mean long-term for how we work together and how we build cultures and how we build community? Because I believe there is no replacement for face-to-face interaction. I was very fortunate earlier this week. Thoughtworks usually has an annual conference where we bring together some of our clients, and obviously it's been off for the last few years, and it happened this week in New York. And while it was quite unnerving at first to be in a room with 100 people, once I got over that and trusted that everyone had COVID tested themselves before we came into the room, it was such an amazing experience, and we're able to connect with each other and with our clients in a way that we just haven't done in the last couple of years. So I do think that it is this tension between all of these amazing benefits that remote working gives us in terms of access to talent and the benefit it brings to people's lives, right? To have that commute time back and to be closer to family. And there's so many great things about it. But the long lasting impacts on relationships and community and culture, I think is to be seen, right? And so that's what I think it's on all of us to continue to try and figure out how to innovate and connect and find, unique ways to bring people in.
And I think also for the retention piece, right? And for folks that have already been there. And I've heard a few just comments in general around folks that have have been working remote, but then they go back to the office, but there isn't that many people in the office, right? And so it's like you're there, but you're not. So how do we kind of function in that hybrid world, right? Where there's it's not awful, but you're still kind of there, but but your colleagues are working remotely, and that connecting piece it's kind of a little all over the place, right? So that's another.
It requires us to be much more intentional and plan ahead for those sorts of things. And so thinking about those moments of connection, like Crystal mentioned, where we have people in small kind of communities and thinking about that, or I would say that word intentional, like when do we want to make the investment to be together and have it be for very specific purposes. We've been talking a lot about our offices and what is the office for? And I think the office for us, at least, is pivoting very much from a place where work got done to a place where socialization happens, right? Where people come together to either collaborate or to socialize. It's no longer a place where, you go to just get some work done. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Definitely. That's such a good point. Final thoughts before we close out. All right. Well, I want to thank Joanna and Crystal for such an amazing conversation. Thank you for being with us today and for providing your thoughts and insights and perspectives. And thank you to the high-tech community for participating and engaging with us. This has been fantastic. We're going to move into the networking portion. So if you want to stay, please do. But if not, we will see you all in a couple of weeks. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Such a great group. Thank you for having us. I love the
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah.